Just past midnight, the lonely gas station on Old Mill Road stood eerily silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, flickering just enough to make the shadows dance unsettlingly. Kyle, working the graveyard shift, sat behind the counter sipping stale coffee. He usually relished these quiet nights. No customers, no distractions, just the rhythmic hum of the station and his own thoughts. But tonight was different. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and the silence carried a strange weight as if something unseen was watching. Kyle couldn't shake the feeling, even as he tried to dismiss it. Around 1 a.m., an old, battered sedan rolled into the lot, its dim headlights barely illuminating the cracked pavement. The driver, a disheveled man in his late 50s with wild, bloodshot eyes, stumbled out. Kyle watched him closely, noting the man's unsteady gait and the nervous way he glanced at the dark woods bordering the gas station. As the man filled his tank, his trembling hands struggled to grip the nozzle. Something about him screamed fear. When the man finished pumping, he hurried inside, the door slamming against the frame. He looked around, his eyes darting to every corner of the small store. "You all right, man?" Kyle asked, keeping his tone calm despite the unease creeping up his spine. The man's head jerked toward him, his panicked gaze locking onto Kyle. You seen anyone around here?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "No, just you," Kyle replied, his stomach tightening. "Why?" They follow you in the dark," the man muttered, almost to himself. "I was driving near the state line, saw her, standing in the road, dressed in white. Couldn't see her face, just white. I didn't stop, but she..." His voice trailed off as he shuddered visibly. "She's here." Kyle chuckled nervously, unsure if the man was joking or just delusional. Before he could respond, the man's face went pale. He pointed a shaking finger toward the parking lot. "She's here," he hissed. Kyle turned to look, and his breath caught in his throat. At the edge of the parking lot stood a woman. She was unnervingly still, draped in a flowing white dress that seemed to shimmer under the flickering lights. Her long, dark hair obscured her face, and her hands hung limply at her sides. Something about her felt deeply wrong, like a glitch in reality. Kyle blinked, and she was gone. "Did you see?" Kyle started. But when he turned back, the man was gone too. His car remained, idling in the lot. Kyle hadn't heard the door chime or seen him leave. The station was deathly quiet. Heart pounding, Kyle stepped outside. The woman was nowhere to be seen, and the car sat abandoned, its headlights casting long, distorted shadows. As Kyle backed away, he heard a whisper behind him, a low, raspy sound that sent ice down his spine. He spun around, but no one was there. The shadows seemed to shift, creeping closer, alive in ways they shouldn't be. Panicked, Kyle bolted back inside and locked the door. Grabbing the phone, he tried to call the police, but the line was dead. Suddenly, the store's speakers crackled with static, growing louder and more oppressive until it drowned out every other sound. And then he saw her again. Reflected in the glass door, she stood right behind him, her face a blurred shadow. A cold, skeletal hand brushed his shoulder. Kyle froze, his scream caught in his throat as the lights flickered and died, plunging the station into darkness. He stumbled backward, blindly groping for anything solid, but she was everywhere now. Reflected in the windows, standing in the aisles, her figure a twisted blur. Her face remained hidden, but he could feel her presence, smell the damp, decaying scent of earth surrounding her. "Kyle," she whispered, her voice hollow and echoing like it came from another world. His blood ran cold as he realized she knew his name. The sound of footsteps echoed outside, slow and deliberate, each step heavier than the last. It was as if someone, or something, was counting down to his doom. The lights surged back on, flooding the station with harsh brightness. Kyle looked around wildly, but the woman was gone. The store was eerily silent, as though nothing had happened. He staggered back, trying to steady his breathing, but his relief was short-lived. The sedan was gone, leaving only a dark, smeared message scrawled across the asphalt. "See you soon." Kyle's hands trembled as he locked the station and bolted to his car. He fumbled with his keys, desperate to escape. But as he climbed into the driver's seat, he froze. In the rearview mirror, he saw her. Her pale, hollow face staring back at him, her empty eyes locking onto his. He screamed, the sound piercing the still night, just as the station lights flickered and went out completely. The next morning, Kyle's car was found idling in the lot, the driver's seat empty, his keys still in the ignition. No one ever saw Kyle again. But some say if you drive down Old Mill Road on a quiet night, you might catch a glimpse of him in your rearview mirror, his terrified eyes staring back at you, silently pleading with you to turn around before it's too late. What do you think happened to Kyle? Was it something supernatural, or could there be another explanation? Would you stop at a lonely gas station after hearing this story? Let's discuss. It was just after midnight, and a dense fog cloaked the desolate stretch of Old Mill Road. The air was thick, heavy with an oppressive stillness that seemed to muffle even the faintest sounds. Jim had been driving for hours, his tired eyes straining to see through the swirling mist. His gas gauge blinked ominously, the needle teetering dangerously close to empty. Relief washed over him as a faint neon glow materialized in the distance. A gas station, barely visible through the haze. It looked like a relic from another era, its rusted sign swaying gently in the night breeze. The station was surrounded by looming trees that stood like silent sentinels, their dark silhouettes pressing in from all sides. Something about the scene sent a shiver down Jim's spine, but he shrugged it off, chalking it up to exhaustion. Pulling into the lot, Jim noticed how eerily quiet it was. The fluorescent lights above the pumps buzzed faintly, casting a flickering glow over the cracked asphalt. The convenience store was dark, its windows covered in grime, and a faded, closed sign hung askew on the door. The place looked abandoned, but the pumps were still operational. Jim stepped out of his car, the night air biting at his skin, and began filling his tank. The silence was unnerving. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the faint hum of electricity. As he waited, he suddenly became aware of a low, whispering sound, faint and distant, like wind brushing through dry leaves. But there was no wind. He froze, his senses on high alert, straining to locate the source of the sound. It was coming from the woods. He squinted into the darkness, his pulse quickening as the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to swirl around him, an incomprehensible chorus that sent a chill racing down his spine. Then he saw her. A woman stood at the edge of the tree line, her figure barely illuminated by the flickering light. She wore a flowing white dress that shimmered faintly, as though it wasn't entirely solid. Her long, dark hair obscured most of her face, but even from a distance, Jim could feel her gaze, cold, piercing, and unrelenting. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. She didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there like a statue carved from shadow. The gas pump clicked, signaling that his tank was full, but Jim couldn't tear his eyes away. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. He spun around, scanning the lot, but there was no sign of her. Heart pounding, he hurriedly replaced the pump, jumped back into his car, and locked the doors. He started the engine, the familiar hum of the motor offering little comfort. As he pulled onto the road, he glanced in his rearview mirror and froze. She was there, sitting in the back seat, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. A low, rattling breath filled the car, and her lips parted as she whispered, "Take me home." Jim's hands trembled on the wheel. "I don't know where your home is," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. She didn't respond, but slowly raised a skeletal hand and pointed at the road ahead. With no other choice, Jim obeyed. He drove in silence, the fog growing thicker with every passing mile. The road seemed endless, winding through dense woods that pressed in on either side like a living tunnel. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and every glance at the mirror revealed her. Closer now, her empty eyes locked onto his. After what felt like hours, she spoke again. "Here," she whispered, her voice like wind through brittle leaves. She gestured toward a narrow dirt path that veered off into the forest. Jim hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to turn back, but his hands moved as if under a spell, guiding the car onto the path. The road was rough, the trees so dense that their branches scraped against the car, but he couldn't stop. The path ended abruptly at an old, decrepit house. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, its walls cloaked in vines. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and a chilling silence hung over the place. "Go inside," she commanded, her voice now cold and sharp. Jim shook his head, his entire body trembling. "Please," he begged. "I don't want to." Before he could finish, the car door creaked open on its own, and a powerful force yanked him out. He stumbled to the ground, his knees scraping against the gravel. The woman stood before him now, her form more solid, her presence suffocating. She pointed to the house again, and Jim's legs moved involuntarily, dragging him toward the door. It creaked open as he approached, revealing nothing but darkness inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him, plunging him into a suffocating void. The whispers returned, louder this time, a chaotic symphony that seemed to come from all directions. "You're home now," her voice echoed, chilling and final. The next morning, the gas station was as silent as ever, its pumps still and its lights flickering faintly. Jim's car sat abandoned at the edge of the lot, its engine cold and its keys still in the ignition. But of Jim, there was no trace. The old dirt path had vanished, and the house was nowhere to be found. They say if you drive down Old Mill Road on a foggy night, you might see the woman in white standing at the edge of the woods. Some say she's waiting for her next ride home, while others whisper that she's looking for someone to replace her. Would you stop if you saw her? Would you risk meeting her empty gaze, knowing what might await you in the darkness? Under the oppressive weight of the night, Carly's exhausted hands gripped the wheel tighter. The highway stretched endlessly before her, lit only by her dim headlights. She had been driving for hours, her gas gauge now precariously low, and when the neon glow of a gas station sign appeared on the horizon, it felt like salvation. But as she pulled into the station, her relief was quickly overshadowed by unease. The station looked like it had been forgotten by time. Rust streaked down the pumps, the sign above the store dangled precariously and faint. Flickering lights struggled to keep the darkness at bay. Carly shivered as a cold breeze sliced through the humid air. She stepped out of her car, the pump creaking as she started to fill the tank. The stillness around her was suffocating. The only sound was the rhythmic hum of the gas dispenser. She glanced around nervously, scanning the shadows that seemed to inch closer with every passing second. Movement from the corner of her eye startled her, and she turned sharply toward the store. Through the grime-covered window, she spotted a figure standing at the counter. A man, or at least it seemed to be. His uniform was old, faded, and frayed, and his posture was unnervingly rigid. As the dim light caught his face, Carly froze. Something was wrong. His features were grotesquely distorted. His skin looked gray and waxy, and his lips stretched into an unnatural grin that sent a chill straight to her core. She blinked, and he was gone. Her breath quickened as she scanned the area, but the lot was empty, the woods beyond ominously still. Carly hurriedly replaced the nozzle and made her way toward the store to pay. The bell above the door jangled as she entered, its sound echoing in the eerily silent interior. Dust coated the shelves, and the aisles were lined with expired goods. A faint odor hung in the air, sour and damp, like something long forgotten. "Hello?" Carly called out, her voice cracking slightly. There was no response. As she turned to leave, a hand shot out from behind the counter, cold fingers gripping her wrist. Carly screamed, spinning around to face the man she had seen through the window. Up close, he was even more horrifying. His skin looked brittle, his eyes sunken and lifeless, yet his grotesque smile remained fixed in place. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered, his voice dry and hollow, like the rustling of dead leaves. Carly yanked her arm away, her pulse hammering. "I just needed gas," she stammered. "I'll pay and go." The man's head tilted, his cloudy eyes narrowing as he whispered again, his voice barely audible. She's here. She's always here. He pointed toward the back of the store, his trembling hand indicating a door slightly ajar. Every fiber of Carly's being screamed at her to leave, but she found herself stepping forward, drawn inexplicably toward the shadowy doorway. Her breath hitched as she pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit storage room. A single bulb flickered weakly above, casting jagged shadows across piles of old boxes and forgotten debris. And then she saw her. A woman stood in the far corner, her back to Carly. She wore a white dress, tattered and stained, and her long, tangled hair hung down to her waist. She was humming softly, a haunting melody that sent icy tendrils of fear crawling up Carly's spine. "Ma'am," Carly whispered, her voice trembling. The woman stopped humming, her head tilting slightly. Slowly, she began to turn. Carly's stomach dropped as the woman's face came into view. Her eyes were empty black voids, her skin stretched tightly over her skull, and her lips were cracked, twisted into a grin far too wide for her face. Carly stumbled back, her heart pounding. The woman took a step forward, then another, her movements unnatural and jerky. The humming grew louder, filling the room, drowning out Carly's frantic thoughts. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. Cold, skeletal fingers brushed against her arm, and a voice, soft and chilling, whispered in her ear, "Stay with me." Carly screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the humming, which now filled every inch of the air. Her vision blurred as the world spiraled into blackness. The next morning, her car was discovered idling in the lot, the pump still hanging from the tank. The gas station itself was eerily silent, abandoned as if no one had been there in years. Carly was nowhere to be found. Authorities searched the area but found no trace of her, no evidence that she had ever been there beyond her car. Rumors began to spread about the old gas station on the highway. Drivers whispered of strange sights and eerie sounds, of a woman in white watching from the shadows. Some claimed to hear her humming, faint but persistent, carried on the wind. And if you were unlucky enough to stop and investigate, you might just find yourself drawn into the darkness, unable to leave. What would you do if you were Carly? Would you have gone into that back room? Or would you have trusted your instincts and fled? The rain poured down in relentless sheets, drumming on the roof of Dave's car as he drove along the deserted highway. His gas gauge blinked urgently, the needle hovering dangerously close to empty. He cursed under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter, scanning the endless darkness for any sign of life. Just as his anxiety reached its peak, a dimly lit sign emerged from the gloom, its letters barely legible: gas and groceries. The flickering light buzzed faintly, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. It was the only place for miles. The gas station looked like a relic from another time, with peeling paint and a rusting awning that swayed precariously in the wind. Dave pulled up to the single pump, its faded numbers barely visible, and killed the engine. As he stepped out, the icy rain instantly soaked through his jacket, chilling him to the bone. He glanced toward the convenience store, a small, grimy building with fogged-up windows and a flickering open sign. For a moment, he thought he saw movement inside, but the rain distorted his vision, and he brushed it off as nothing. Sliding his credit card into the pump, Dave tried to focus on the rhythmic hum of the machine, blocking out the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. The night was oppressively quiet, save for the rain and the occasional groan of the awning in the wind. Then he heard it, a faint scraping noise, like nails dragging across metal. He froze, his hand still gripping the gas nozzle, and turned his head toward the store. The windows glistened with rainwater, and beyond them, the dim light cast unsettling, shifting shadows. He squinted, trying to peer inside, but the glass only reflected his own pale, rain-soaked face. "Probably just the wind," he muttered to himself, shaking his head. But as he returned his focus to the pump, the scraping sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, rhythmic, and too close for comfort. Against his better judgment, Dave took a hesitant step toward the store. The closer he got, the colder the air seemed to grow. His breath fogged up in front of him as he reached for the door handle. Before his hand made contact, the door creaked open on its own, swinging inward with an eerie slowness. "Hello?" Dave called out, his voice shaky and uncertain. No response. He stepped inside, immediately hit by the overwhelming stench of mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. The interior was dimly lit, the shelves sparsely stocked with dusty cans and faded snack wrappers. His boots echoed on the grimy tile floor as he moved further in, every step filling him with a growing sense of dread. Then he saw him. Behind the counter stood a man, or at least what looked like a man. He was hunched over, his tattered uniform hanging loosely on his gaunt frame. His hands gripped the edge of the counter, their gray, mottled skin stretching over knobby bones. His head hung low, obscured by a greasy tangle of hair. "Hey, you work here?" Dave asked, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. The man didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. Then, slowly, he began to straighten up, his movements unnatural, like a puppet on strings. When he finally looked up, Dave's stomach dropped. The man's face was a grotesque mask of decay. Pale, stretched skin barely clinging to his skull, sunken eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, and a mouth twisted into an impossibly wide grin, exposing jagged, yellow teeth. "You shouldn't have stopped," the man rasped, his voice like gravel grinding against metal. Dave stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. I just needed gas," he stammered. But the man didn't seem to hear him. He began to move, his steps jerky and mechanical, his grin never wavering. "You'll stay," the man hissed, his voice low and guttural. "They all stay." The lights flickered violently, plunging the store into brief darkness. When they came back on, the man was gone. But Dave wasn't alone. He felt the air shift around him, heard the faint sound of something dragging across the floor. He turned toward the shelves and saw them. Shadowy figures emerging from the aisles, their movements slow and deliberate. Their faces were hidden, but their empty, hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and their mouths twisted into the same horrifying grin as the man behind the counter. Panic surged through Dave as the figures began to close in. He bolted for the door, but it slammed shut in his face, the handle refusing to budge. He banged on the glass, screaming for help, but his cries were swallowed by the oppressive silence. The figures surrounded him now, their skeletal hands reaching out, their voices overlapping in a sinister whisper that grew louder and louder until it was deafening. Dave felt their icy grip on his arms, his shoulders, his neck, pulling him down into the suffocating darkness. The next morning, a passing trucker noticed Dave's car idling at the pump. The door to the convenience store hung ajar, creaking gently in the breeze. But there was no sign of Dave, no sign of anyone. The police searched the area, but the station had been abandoned for years. The only clue was a faint trail of muddy footprints leading from the pump into the woods, where they disappeared without a trace. To this day, locals say that on stormy nights, if you stop at that old gas station, you might catch a glimpse of shadowy figures moving inside, their hollow eyes watching, waiting for the next unlucky traveler to pull in. Would you dare to stop, or would you drive on, risking the unknown road ahead? It was just past midnight when Sarah's car rolled onto the narrow, cracked pavement leading to an old gas station. The rain hammered her windshield, blurring her vision, and her fuel gauge blinked a warning in angry red. She hadn't passed another car in miles, and the dense woods on either side of the road seemed to press closer with every mile. The dim glow of a single flickering light was a welcome, albeit unsettling, sight. Her relief quickly gave way to unease as she pulled into the lot. The gas station was eerily outdated, with its rusty pump standing alone under a metal awning that groaned with every gust of wind. The attached convenience store was no better. A grimy facade, a single dim light spilling through the dirt-smeared windows, and no sign of life. Still, she had no choice. She needed gas, and the highway wasn't going to stretch itself. As Sarah stepped out into the rain, her jacket offered little protection from the cold downpour. She fumbled with the ancient gas pump, its nozzle squealing in protest as she lifted it. While she waited for the gas to flow, she glanced toward the store. A shadow moved behind the glass, and she froze. Squinting, she could just make out the shape of a man standing at the counter. His features were obscured, but his grin, sharp, wide, and unnervingly frozen, was unmistakable. The longer she stared, the more unnatural it seemed. A chill rippled down her spine, and she quickly averted her eyes, focusing instead on the rhythmic clicking of the numbers on the pump. By the time her tank was full, the man at the counter had disappeared. Sarah scanned the store's interior again, but it was empty. The shelves cast warped shadows under the flickering light, and the cash register sat silent and unattended. A sense of foreboding crept over her, but she brushed it off. It was late. People did strange things at odd hours. Maybe the man had gone into the back. She sighed, opened her wallet, and reluctantly made her way to the store to pay. The bell over the door jingled weakly as Sarah stepped inside. The air was thick and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made her nose wrinkle. "Hello," she called, her voice bouncing off the empty aisles. There was no reply, only the hum of a dying fluorescent light. She hesitated by the counter, glancing at the door marked "Employees Only." A faint tapping sound caught her attention, slow, deliberate, and coming from the back room. She took a step toward it, then stopped herself, every instinct screaming for her to leave. "Is someone there?" she asked, her voice trembling. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. She felt the hairs on her neck stand on end as the lights flickered, plunging the store into darkness for a heartbeat before sputtering back to life. When the light returned, something glinted on the floor near her feet, a rusted name tag. She crouched to pick it up, squinting to make out the faded letters. "Jim?" Her pulse quickened as the tapping resumed, louder and closer this time. She spun around, her eyes darting across the aisles. A shadow darted between the shelves, too fast to fully register. "Hello?" she called again, her voice cracking. Then she heard it, a soft, raspy whisper. "Sarah." Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't told anyone her name. Panic surged through her as she backed toward the door, but her foot caught on something. She looked down and stifled a scream. Scattered across the floor were uniforms, each one bearing a name tag. Tim, Lucy, David. All of them torn, stained, and covered in dust. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Sarah." It felt like icy fingers trailing down her spine. She bolted for the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Her heart pounded as the air around her seemed to grow colder. She felt it before she saw it, a presence standing just behind her. The faintest brush of cold breath grazed her neck. Sarah dared a glance over her shoulder and froze. The man from the counter was inches away, his grin impossibly wide, his eyes black voids that seemed to swallow the dim light. "Why leave so soon?" he rasped, his voice dripping with mockery. She screamed, jerking the door handle with all her strength. Just as she thought she'd be trapped forever, the door gave way, and she stumbled out into the rain. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Fumbling with her keys, she glanced back at the store. The man stood in the doorway, waving slowly, mockingly, his grin never faltering. She slammed her door shut, started the engine, and peeled out of the lot. Relief washed over her as the gas station faded in the rearview mirror. But when she glanced back one last time, her heart nearly stopped. The gas station was gone. In its place was an overgrown lot, choked with weeds and wild grass, as if the station had never existed. Shaking, she sped to the nearest diner and stumbled inside. Her story spilled out in a rush, her words tumbling over each other as she described the man, the whispers, the uniforms. The waitress who listened grew pale, her eyes widening with recognition. "That old station burned down years ago," she whispered. "The owner, Jim, died in the fire. People say his spirit haunts that stretch of highway, calling out to travelers by name." Sarah sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. She could still hear the whispers, faint and rasping, echoing in her mind. She never drove that highway again, but even now, years later, she sometimes wakes in the dead of night, heart pounding, convinced she can hear her name being whispered from the shadows. What do you think Jim's intentions were? Was he warning Sarah? Or was he something far more sinister? Share your theories.